Good evening, listeners. How do you do? Welcome to Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts, the podcast. And I'm your host, Mike Lucht, and today's topic, one of those rare instances in which, during the research and writing of said project, I was somewhat assailed by weird phenomena. We'll get into it. So before we proceed, a brief advisory for those listening. The following episode explores various aspects of ancient records, battlefield folklore, and high strangeness. However, during the preparation of this episode, a recurring, anomalous cacophony, the persistent, heavy sound of cicadas, a susurrus of locusts, if you will, seemingly followed me throughout the production of this work. And while it is summertime in Texas, and the sound of cicadas is quite ubiquitous during the day, it normally doesn't follow you inside while you're sitting and working at your laptop, nor does it normally run into the later hours of the night. In fiction and folklore, this nocturnal buzzing in the desert was called al-Azif, which is the original Arabic name chosen for the Necronomicon, meant to translate to the howling or droning of insects, a sound traditionally attributed to the Djinn. In the Islamic tradition, a closely related phenomena is known as was. It was the quiet, what was it? Was. The quiet psychic whispering of these entities directly into the human ear. During the writing of this material, it also frequently felt as though the script was taking on an uncanny, sort of unsolicited architecture of its own, as if I was writing it in a trance-like state at many moments. It's like I felt like I was preparing a strategic proposal for presentation to a high-level military security council or senior command structure. So, if you find yourself susceptible to viral information hazards, or if the subject of Djinn warfare begins to resonate a little too sharply with your own environment, consider this your warning. You're listening to a record of operational protocols used to bind, command, and deploy entities that exist just beyond the veil of our sensory reality. The research presented here is both theoretical and historical, but the phenomena described are persistent and potentially continue to this day. So please, proceed with caution. This is Plasma Consciousness and Djinn Warfare. Let's get into it! The subject before us this episode is not mythology, it's not folklore. It's not the idle speculation of conspiracy theorists or the fevered dreams of occultists. What we're examining is, by every historical and anthropological standard, one of the most sophisticated systems of unconventional warfare ever developed by human civilization. A system so ancient that it predates written history, so cross-culturally consistent that it defies simple explanation as cultural diffusion, and so potentially consequential that it may represent the ultimate asymmetric advantage in modern conflict. We're speaking of Djinn warfare, the deliberate summoning, binding, and strategic deployment of entities that exist at the threshold of our understanding. Beings created, according to Islamic theology, from smokeless fire, and according to emerging plasma physics hypotheses, from self-organizing electromagnetic fields capable of sustaining non-biological consciousness. To understand Djinn warfare is to understand that human conflict has never been merely physical. From the earliest recorded battles to the most sophisticated cyber operations of today, warfare has always operated on multiple planes simultaneously. The material, the psychological, and what we might term the supramaterial. The great strategists have always known this. Sun Tzu spoke of winning without fighting. Clausewitz wrote of the fog of war and the importance of breaking the enemy's will. But the practitioners of Djinn warfare understood something deeper, that there exist entities capable of operating in dimensions adjacent to our own, and that these entities possess capabilities far exceeding human limitations, and that under specific conditions, they can be bound to human will and directed towards strategic objectives. This isn't superstition. This is applied metaphysics with a military objective. The theoretical framework of Djinn warfare rests upon three foundational pillars that appear with remarkable consistency across every culture that has documented these practices. First is the principle of dimensional access. Jinn are understood to exist in a parallel realm, variously called the Alam al-Ghaib in Islamic tradition. And bear with me, I don't speak Arabic. I'm try my best. The Duat in ancient Egyptian cosmology, or simply the in-between or other world in various folk traditions. This isn't a supernatural realm in the sense of being outside of nature, but rather a different configuration of matter and energy that occupies the same spatial coordinates as our own reality, but remains normally imperceptible to us. The physics of this realm differ from our own. Entities existing there aren't bound by the same constraints of mass, gravity, or temporality that govern biological life. Yet they can, under specific conditions, cross the boundary into human perceptual reality. Second is the principle of binding. This is perhaps the most crucial and most dangerous aspect of Jinn warfare. The entities in question possess independent consciousness, moral agency, and what we would recognize as free will. They're not automatons. They can't simply be commanded without consequence. However, through specific rituals involving precise combinations of symbols, names, and material components, a practitioner can establish a contractual relationship with a Jinn. A binding that compels service in exchange for specific considerations, or that constrains the entity's natural behavior through what amounts to metaphysical leverage. The mechanics of this binding vary by tradition, but the underlying principle remains constant. These entities respond to specific stimuli, respect particular boundaries, and can be constrained by those who understand their nature. Third is the principle of specialized capabilities. Not all Jinn are equivalent. Just as a modern military maintains specialized units for different operational requirements, naval forces, airborne divisions, special operations, intelligence services, etc. The taxonomy of Jinn recognizes distinct categories with distinct capabilities and limitations. Understanding this taxonomy is essential for operational planning. For deploying the wrong class of Jinn to a strategic objective isn't merely ineffective, but potentially catastrophic. The classification system most widely accepted in Arabic traditions, and which finds surprising parallels in Chinese, Vedic, and European sources, recognizes several primary categories. At the apex are the Afrit, or singular Afrit, described in historical texts as enormous winged creatures of immense physical strength and cunning. These are the heavy weapons of Jinn warfare, deployed when massive destruction is required, when fortifications must be breached, or when overwhelming force must be applied against enemy formations. Their power is matched only by their danger. They're the most difficult to bind and the most likely to turn on insufficiently skilled practitioners. Below the Afrit are the Marid, entities associated with water and fluid dynamics. These are the naval and coastal warfare specialists, essentially, capable of disrupting maritime operations, sinking vessels, destroying port infrastructure, and controlling weather patterns over water. Their knowledge of hidden treasures and submerged secrets also makes them valuable for intelligence gathering in shoreline and or coastal environments. The Ghul, plural Gilan, represents a different category entirely. These are entities associated with death, decay, and psychological terror. They inhabit graveyards and desolate places. In warfare applications, they're deployed for terror operations, spreading disease through supernatural means, targeting specific individuals with psychological destruction, and for operations requiring infiltration of burial grounds or desecration of sacred sites. They're among the most dangerous to employ, not merely because of their malevolent nature, but because they are notoriously difficult to control once unleashed. The Sila are shapeshifters, capable of assuming human forms with varying degrees of perfection. These are the intelligence assets and deep cover operatives of Jinn warfare. They specialize in deception, infiltration, assassination, and psychological manipulation. Their ability to walk among humans undetected makes them invaluable for operations requiring human-level interaction, from political assassinations to strategic deception. Finally, the Djinn are the most common and lesser category, often described as the infantry or surveillance drones of the Djinn hierarchy. They're used for reconnaissance, minor harassment operations, guarding specific locations, and maintaining surveillance over target areas. While individually limited, they can be deployed in large numbers and are relatively easy to bind and control. This taxonomy isn't arbitrary either. It reflects a sophisticated understanding of what we might now call asset management in supernatural warfare. A practitioner who attempts to use a Djinn for heavy demolition work will fail. One who deploys an Ifrit for subtle intelligence gathering will likely create more destruction than successfully gathering information. The strategic application of Djinn warfare requires the same operational planning as conventional military operations: assessment of objectives, matching of assets to requirements, and contingency planning for when things go wrong. The cross-cultural consistency of this operational taxonomy becomes undeniable when we look beyond the borders of the Middle East. The classifications we apply to the Djinn are not localized anomalies. They're simply regional names for a universal phenomenon mapped by completely isolated civilizations with staggering uniformity. Around 3000 BCE, Chinese scholars compiling the Shanhaijing, or Classic of Mountains and Seas, documented identical territorial fire intelligence entities that modern researchers recognize as the exact counterparts to the Arabian Djinn. In these texts, as well as Geihong's later Baopuzi, these beings were systematically categorized not as ghosts, but as independent, non-biological entities of energy. The Chinese mapped the Huoxin, or fire spirits, and Huojing, or fire essences, according to their precise geographical domains, noting their volatile temperaments and their capacity to cause sudden mass madness or spontaneous environmental ignition, the exact tactical signatures of an unbound Ifrit or Ghoul. Similarly, the Vedic traditions of ancient India established a highly sophisticated three-tier hierarchy of fire-born, non-human entities that perfectly mirrors the Arabic classification system. The Rigveda and the Atharva Veda isolate the Rakshasa as powerful cosmic-scale ancient entities, the operational equivalent of the Marid or Ifrit. The Pishacha as lesser, highly territorial entities that inhabit desolate environments and battlefields to feed on decay, the exact behavior profile of the Ghoul. And the Bhuta, which operate as volatile, localized energy remnants. When we step into Western Europe, the same structural archetypes emerge within the complex framework of pre-Christian fairy folklore and Renaissance grimoire traditions. The Fae, or good people, of Celtic and Germanic lore were never the delicate winged creatures of modern children's fairy books. They were described as a parallel hidden civilization of immense power, made of light or air, occupying the same spatial coordinates as humans. They possessed moral free will, divided themselves into distinct military and social hierarchies, such as the Seelie and Unseelie courts, and could be highly hostile if their territories were violated. Just like the Seela, they were masters of glamour, a sophisticated form of visual deception and shapeshifting used to infiltrate human communities. Whether an operator studies the Huojing of the Chinese Waste, the Pishacha of the Vedic field manuals, the Fae of Western European isolation, or the Shadim of the Levant, the conclusion is inescapable. Different cultures, separated by thousands of miles and completely different languages, independently discovered and mapped the exact same non-biological energetic ecosystems. Now, I know that so far this all sounds a bit like the beginnings of a Dungeons & Dragons campaign setup, but now is where we get into the really cool shit. Historical precedents. The historical record of Djinn warfare extends back to the earliest written documents, and likely farther beyond that. In the ancient Near East, where civilization first developed systems of writing and organized warfare, we find simultaneous development of techniques for engaging with non-human entities in combat contexts. The pre-Islamic Arabian tradition provides our most detailed early documentation. In these societies, Djinn were not fringe beliefs, but central components of the cosmological understanding. They were considered powerful entities made of smokeless fire who existed in a parallel dimension to humans, and certain individuals, known as Sahar or sorcerers, and Mu'alim al-Jinn or Djinn trainers, claimed the ability to contact, command, and utilize these beings for various purposes, including warfare. These were not marginal figures. In many cases, they served as advisors to kings and generals, their supernatural capabilities integrated into state military planning. The medieval Arabic grimoires provide our most systematic documentation of these practices. The Shams al-Marif, or the Sun of Knowledge, or Gnosis, represents perhaps the most comprehensive manual of Djinn operations ever compiled. Attributed to the 13th century scholar Al-Buni, This text contains detailed instructions for summoning, binding, and deploying Djinn for various purposes, including military applications. The text assumes a sophisticated readership already familiar with basic protective protocols and moves quickly into advanced operational techniques. Equally significant are the various works attributed to King Solomon, known in Islamic tradition as Suleiman. The historical Solomon, whether as a historical figure or a composite of several rulers, was said to have commanded both demons and Djinn through divine wisdom and magical seals. The Testament of Solomon and related texts describes a systematic approach to supernatural labor organization with different categories of entities assigned to specific construction tasks, military operations, and intelligence gathering. Whether these texts represent historical records or idealized projections of royal power, they demonstrate that by the first millennium BCE, the concept of organized Djinn warfare was fully developed in the Near East. But the Arabian tradition wasn't unique. Parallel developments occurred across the ancient world with remarkable consistency that suggest either extraordinary cultural diffusion or independent discovery of similar phenomena. In ancient China, the classic of mountain and seas, the Shanhai Jing, dating to approximately 300 BCE, documents fire intelligence beings called Huoxin inhabiting specific territories. These entities weren't merely described, but classified, their behaviors mapped, and their vulnerabilities cataloged. The text represents a systematic approach to supernatural geography that would be essential for any military campaign requiring movement through territory controlled by such entities. Later Chinese sources provide even more specific operational protocols. Gihong's Baopuzi, written in 317 CE, provides a comprehensive taxonomy classifying Huojing, or fire essence beings, as the most powerful category of supernatural entity. A Tang Dynasty exorcism manual, preserved as document P3835 from the Dunhuang Caves, prescribes a specific four-step protocol for managing these beings. Written binding script, aromatic smoke, protective circles drawn around the practitioner, and verbal declarations of the being's elemental origin. This protocol mirrors in striking detail the procedures documented in Arabic sources thousands of kilometers away and centuries later. The Vedic Indian tradition provides equally systematic documentation. The Rigveda, dating to approximately 1300 BCE, addresses fireborn beings called Rakshasa with a three-tier hierarchy that anticipates the Arabic classification system. The Rakshasa proper, powerful cosmic-scale ancient beings, the Pishacha, lesser territorial entities, and the Bhuta, recently transitioned fire beings with unresolved claims or grievances. This taxonomy suggests a sophisticated understanding of entity maturation and power gradients that would be essential for operational planning. In Persia, the Zoroastrian tradition developed perhaps the most systematic dualistic framework for understanding supernatural conflict. The Avesta describes fire beings called Devas and Divs, with Angra Mainyu, aka Ahriman, the destructive spirit, created from fire before the material world itself. The Vendidad portion of the text provides detailed instructions for conducting spiritual warfare against these entities, including the use of iron implements as weapons and barriers, fire as offensive and protective measures, and specific verbal formulas involving speaking entity names in reverse as neutralizing techniques. Comic book fans might note that this is not at all dissimilar to the tactics used to banish fifth-dimensional imps such as Mr. Mxyzptlk back to their home realm. Yeah, nerd alert. But it does bear mentioning that in the continuity of DC Comics, fifth-dimensional beings are actually considered to be the foundational basis behind the vast majority of historical and folkloric entity encounters, and that this ancient folklore finds new ways to express itself as culture evolves. Just saying. Anywho, the ancient Egyptian tradition, preserved in texts like the Ladon London Papyrus from approximately 2600 BCE, describes summoning rituals for entities called Ak, or luminous ones, described as firelight intelligences existing in the Duat, or between world. These protocols specify desert locations, strict iron prohibitions, which is interesting given the Persian and Vedic emphasis on iron as protective, circles of salt around practitioners, and aromatic smoke offerings. The Egyptian tradition adds the important element of location specificity. Certain types of operations could only be conducted in particular geographic contexts. The Hebrew tradition, documented in the Testament of Solomon and the Babylonian Talmud, describes copper seals used to command shedim for the construction of the first temple. Deuteronomy 32:17 and Psalm 106:37 specifically condemn sacrifices to these beings, indicating not merely their existence but their active engagement with human communities and the perceived danger of such engagement. The Talmudic tradition provides systematic classifications and protection methods that parallel the Arabic and Vedic systems with remarkable consistency. This cross-cultural consistency is one of the most puzzling and significant aspects of Djinn warfare theory. The specific protocols, iron as protective or prohibited depending on tradition, fire as elemental affinity, circles of protection, aromatic offerings, verbal formulas of binding, and so forth, appear too specific to be explained by simple cultural diffusion. The geographic distribution from China to the Atlantic, the temporal range from 3000 BCE to the present, and the detailed technical similarities suggest either an extraordinary shared empirical discovery or the documentation of actual phenomena that different cultures independently learn to engage with. While theological and grimoire traditions establish the theoretical taxonomy of Djinn warfare, the historical record contains numerous narrative accounts where these protocols were reportedly deployed in active theaters of war. These chronicles, preserved in imperial records, regional histories, and military diaries, move beyond abstract rituals into the specific tactical application of non-human entities during historical conflicts. Rather than anomalous folklore, these accounts treat the utilization of sehar or sorcerers and mu'alim al-jinn or jinn trainers as standard, if highly specialized, branches of military intelligence and asymmetrical warfare. Now let's look at a few recorded historical instances of jinn deployment during warfare. So first we've got the Siege of Marib and the Himyarite-Axonite War, circa 525 CE. One of the earliest narratives of state-level entity deployment occurs during the twilight of the Himyarite kingdom in ancient Yemen. Faced with an invasion by the Christian kingdom of Aksum, the Jewish convert king Du-Nuwas reportedly retreated to the strategic highlands surrounding the Great Dam of Marib. According to early Islamic historians like Ibn Hisham and Al-Tabari, Du-Nuwas maintained a dedicated cadre of Sahar, drawn from the desert tribes of Najran and Hadramaut. Hadramaut. We'll go with Hadramaut. Who claimed ancestral pacts with the Ifrit, the most volatile and destructive class of subterranean jinn. The narrative accounts describe a defensive operation where the Himyarite forces did not engage the Aksumite vanguard directly. Instead, the sorcerers established a network of copper-inscribed geometric arrays along the mountain passes. During the Aksumite advance, contemporary chronicles record a phenomenon described as scorch wind without sun, or samum, which swept through the canyon walls. The Aksumite war elephants, highly sensitive to environmental and infrasonic anomalies, panicked and trampled their own infantry. The Aksumite general, Abraha, later documented that his troops encountered invisible archers, quote-unquote, whose presence was signaled only by the sudden spontaneous ignition of supply wagons and the localized boiling of natural springs. This narrative directly matches the technical protocols found in later Arabic grimoires, which dictate that Ifrit deployment manifests primarily through thermal manipulation, sudden atmospheric pressure drops, and psychological terror designed to induce mass panic, or ruba'ah. Ruba'ah? R-U-apostrophe-B, in cavalry and livestock. Then there's the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah and the Islamic conquest of Persia, 636 CE. During the decisive Battle of Al-Qadisiyah between the Rashid-al-Din Caliphate and the Sasanian Persian Empire, Arab historical tradition records a highly unorthodox intelligence-gathering operation. The Sasanian commander, Rastam Farrakhzad, was known to utilize astrologers and magi, or magians, magicians, who practiced the ancient Persian protocols of the Vendidad, attempting to field devas, or fire spirits, to disrupt the Muslim cavalry. In response, the Arab general Sa'id ibn Abi Waqqas reportedly utilized a group of Mu'alim al-Jinn from the Banu Asad tribe, the Jinn tamers. These individuals were tasked not with offensive strikes, but with counter-espionage and airspace denial. Narrative accounts details a clash of winds above the battlefield, quote-unquote clash of winds, on the final day of combat. While the physical armies fought in a blinding dust storm, the Arabic chronicles describe the sky as filled with quote-unquote luminous banners and quote-unquote crackling sparks, interpreted as a direct engagement between the converted Islamic jinn or jinn mu'minun and the Persian devas. The tactical outcome of this alleged entity warfare was highly material. The dust storm was reported to have shifted direction abruptly, blowing directly into the eyes of the Sasanian forces and blowing away Rostam's canopy, exposing his command tent to a direct assault. The narrative underscores a critical doctrine in early Islamic military theory, that jinn warfare was primarily viewed as a struggle for battlefield psychology and environmental control, where neutralizing the enemy's occult assets was paramount to physical victory. Then there's the Mongol siege of Baghdad and the Abbasid countermeasures in 1258 CE. The fall of Baghdad to Hulagu Khan provides a tragic narrative of failed defensive entity deployment. As the Mongol war machine surrounded the Abbasid capital, the Caliph al-Mustasim was advised by his vizier Ibn al-Alkami and various court esotericists that the city would be defended using the supreme talismans of the Shams al-Marif, specifically the summoning of the Marid, the most powerful cosmic-scale jinn entities. According to Persian historian Rashid-al-Din in the Jami al-Tawarikh, the Abbasid court magicians spent weeks constructing a massive silver array atop the city's highest minarets, burning rare resins and chanting the secret names of binding to unleash a supernatural tempest upon the Mongol camp. However, the narrative highlights a catastrophic failure in operational protocol. The Mongol forces had brought with them Chinese Taoist masters and sorcerers skilled in the Baopuzi and Dunhuang protocols of Huo-Jing containment. The Chinese masters recognized the atmospheric shifts indicating an entity summoning. They introduced the Mongol engineers to encircle the city walls with massive iron rings and to load their catapults not with stone, but with iron-rich slag and sulfurous fire, exploiting the universal elemental vulnerability of jinn to iron. When the Abbasid sorcerers attempted to direct the entity-driven storm, the protective arrays were shattered by the physical impact of the iron projectiles. The entities, bound to a broken geometry, reportedly turned inward upon the city itself, inducing a state of mass hallucinations and despair among the defenders before the physical walls were even breached. Then there's the Ottoman-Safavid conflicts and the Janissary grimoires, circa 1514 CE. In the early modern era, the geopolitical rivalry between the Sunni Ottoman Empire under Sultan Selim I and the Shia Safavid Empire under Shah Ismail I saw the institutionalization of entity warfare within regular state militaries. Shah Ismail, a charismatic religious leader who claimed divine incarnation, openly integrated esoteric practices into his military doctrine. His elite forces, the Kizilbash, I think that's how you say it, were believed to be shielded by spiritual entities bound through Sufi and Kaula-influenced occult lineages. That's tantric sorcery as well. To counter this, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I commissioned the creation of specialized military grimoires, later discovered among the Topkapi Palace archives. These manuals instructed the elite Janissary Corps on how to engrave specific hafiz, or protective verses, and copper-lead alloy seals onto their muskets, armor, and artillery barrels. During the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, the Safavid cavalry charged the Ottoman lines, expecting their spiritual protections to cause the Ottoman firearms to misfire, a phenomenon often attributed to local jinn interference with black powder. The Ottoman narrative accounts note that the Janissary artillery, treated with specialized lead ink inscriptions and fired in synchronized volleys, broke the Safavid charge. The Ottoman chronicler Selalzaid Mustafa wrote that the Safavid forces were accompanied by ghouls of the waste, that withered when exposed to the continuous thunder of the Ottoman cannons. This represents a pivotal transition in the history of Djinn warfare, the integration of traditional esoteric binding protocols with early modern firearms and artillery, treating the physical explosion of gunpowder and the kinetic impact of lead as an industrial-scale method of entity dispersal. When these historical case studies are analyzed side by side with the theoretical protocols of the ancient Near East, China, and India, several consistent tactical principles emerge. The doctrine of inversion. In every historical theater, the side deploying the entities attempts to invert natural law, turning a tailwind into a headwind, causing firearms to misfire, blinding the enemy with localized storms, etc. And there's the materiality of countermeasures. The defense against these entities is never purely spiritual. It requires material reality. Whether it's the iron rings of the Mongols, the copper-lead seals of the Janissaries, or the salt perimeters of the Egyptian papyri, physical elements act as the definitive anchors or disruptors of the entity's energetic form. There's always, of course, the risk of backlash. The historical record consistently warns that non-human entities possess no inherent loyalty to human states. If the binding geometry is disrupted, or if the practitioner's willpower falters, the entity force invariably collapses back upon its summoner, turning an asymmetric asset into a total strategic liability. To understand Djinn warfare as a military discipline rather than a religious practice or superstition, we must examine the technical protocols with the same rigor we would apply to analyzing any weapon system or intelligence methodology. The practitioners of these arts across all cultures develop sophisticated operational procedures that can be analyzed in terms of preparation, execution, and termination phases. The preparation phase in Djinn warfare is arguably the most critical and time-consuming. Unlike conventional weapons that can be deployed immediately upon acquisition, Djinn require extensive preparation of both the operator and the operational environment. Candidates for Djinn warfare training, whether called Sahar, Shaman, Exorcist, or simply Practitioner, typically undergo extensive purification rituals designed to alter their biological and energetic state to be compatible with entity contact. These rituals often involve dietary restrictions, celibacy, specific physical conditioning, and meditative practices intended to heighten sensitivity to supernatural phenomena. The training curriculum includes learning specialized languages and scripts, including what various traditions call the language of the Djinn. This isn't merely linguistic training, but involves learning vibrational patterns, symbolic systems, and mathematical correspondences that are believed to resonate with entity consciousness. Advanced training involves direct contact with progressively more powerful Djinn, learning their true names, which in these traditions represent not merely labels, but vibrational keys to the entity's essential nature, their specific vulnerabilities, and the complex rituals required for summoning and control. The operational environment preparation is equally critical. Djinn operations cannot be conducted arbitrarily in any location. The text consistently emphasized the importance of specific geographic contexts, desert locations, mountain passes, crossroads, and liminal spaces between defined territories. These locations are described as naturally thin places where the barrier between human reality and the entity realm is more permeable. The protective circle is a universal feature across all traditions, though its specific composition varies. In Arabic and Vedic traditions, iron is frequently used, either as a circle of iron implements or as a drawn circle with iron instruments. In Egyptian tradition, salt serves a similar function. The circle serves multiple purposes. It creates a protected space where the practitioner is safe from entity aggression. It establishes a boundary that entities cannot cross without permission, and it creates a controlled environment for the binding contract to be negotiated. Aromatic smoke offerings appear in virtually every tradition, from the frankincense and myrrh of Arabian and Hebrew rituals to the specific incense prescribed in Chinese and Vedic texts. These aren't merely atmospheric effects. They're understood to create a medium through which entities can manifest or perceive the human operator. The specific chemical composition of these smokes may interact with the plasma-based consciousness hypothesized by modern researchers, providing a medium for electromagnetic pattern formation. The verbal component of Djinn operations is particularly sophisticated. It involves not merely speaking words, but generating specific vibrational frequencies through ritual recitation. The Vedic tradition emphasizes this particularly strongly, with precise tonal requirements for mantras intended to bind or repel entities. The concept of the true name is crucial here. Knowing an entity's true name provides leverage over it because the name represents the vibrational signature of the entity's consciousness. To speak the name is to establish a connection to the entity's essential nature. The theoretical framework of asset deployment inevitably demands a mechanism of absolute enforcement. To understand how these entities are held to their strategic objectives, one must examine the deeply legalistic and bureaucratic architecture that governs the invisible world. This intersection of law and the supernatural finds its earliest institutional blueprint in the Western esoteric tradition through King Solomon's attributed creation of the ars notaria, Latin for the notary art. Latin for the notary art, or in keeping with the occasional comic book references, what John Constantine would likely refer to as the Ars. As a distinct book within the Lemegeton, or Lesser Key of Solomon, the Ars Notaria represents a radical shift away from crude sorcery toward a highly structured contractual methodology. It established that interactions with extra-dimensional intelligences, be they Djinn, demons, or angels, are fundamentally legal transactions requiring precise verbal formulas, written charters, and notary-like declarations. The Ars Notaria provided the practitioner with a specialized linguistic and mnemonic framework designed to rapidly integrate vast amounts of hidden knowledge and command authority. Under the Solomonic doctrine, an entity isn't controlled through mere brute psychological force, but by citing higher cosmic laws, invoking immutable binding titles, and presenting an airtight legal contract that the entity is metaphysically powerless to violate. This concept of the entity as a legal subject is even more pronounced within Islamic jurisprudence, or fiqh, F-I-Q-H, where the Jinn possess an immense, formalized legalistic presence that persists into modern Islamic law. Far from being wild, lawless monsters, Jinn are classified under Islamic theology as mukallaf, meaning that they are legally accountable beings bound by moral agency, free will, and religious law, just like humans. For over a millennium, classical jurists like Ibn Taymiyyah and courts across the Islamic world have written extensive legal treatises regarding the intersection of human and jinn societies. Islamic law explicitly accounts for the civil rights and criminal liabilities of jinn, regulating complex legal scenarios such as the real estate property occupied by territorial entities, the validity of contracts drafted under jinn-induced duress, and the strict legal prohibition against human-jinn marriages, or nikah al-jinn. In the eyes of Islamic law, the jinn are a parallel citizenry bound by cosmic jurisprudence. Therefore, any attempt by a human operator to engage with them is treated less like an act of primitive magic and more like a high-stakes corporate negotiation or international treaty negotiation with a foreign national. The binding ritual itself is the operational climax. This is where the practitioner establishes control over the entity through a combination of leverage points, knowledge of the name, the protective circle, the aromatic medium, and specific contractual terms. The binding isn't permanent. It requires maintenance, renewal, and careful management of the terms. A bound jinn is not a slave, but a contracted operative, and like any intelligence asset, requires handling, motivation, and clear operational parameters. The termination phase is equally critical and often overlooked in popular understanding. Jinn can't simply be dismissed like closing a computer program. They require specific release protocols, acknowledgement of contract completion, and often specific offerings or compensations. Failure to properly terminate a jinn operation can result in the entity remaining attached to the operator or the operational area, causing ongoing disruption, possession phenomena, or what would now be termed poltergeist activity. The strategic applications of these technical protocols are diverse and sophisticated. In offensive operations, the Ifrit can be deployed to cause physical destruction, create natural disasters, or directly attack enemy forces. Historical accounts suggest they can manipulate weather patterns, cause structural collapse, and generate fires that can't be extinguished by normal means. The Marid are deployed against naval targets, capable of sinking ships, disrupting port operations, and controlling coastal weather to prevent amphibious landings or maritime resupply. The ghouls specialize in terror operations and biological warfare. They can be sent to target specific individuals with psychological destruction, causing what appears to be madness but is actually a sustained supernatural attack. They're associated with disease vectors and can be deployed to spread illness through enemy populations. The Sila provide human intelligence and deceptive capabilities, infiltrating enemy organizations, assassinating key personnel, and spreading disinformation. The Djinn serve as reconnaissance assets, providing surveillance of enemy positions and early warning of impending attacks. Defensive applications are equally sophisticated. Practitioners establish protective barriers around strategic locations using circles of protection, deploy sentinel Djinn to guard perimeters, and create early warning systems based on entity detection of hostile supernatural activity. Some traditions describe the creation of Djinn armies, formations of these entities organized hierarchically and deployed much like conventional military units with command structures, operational sectors, and coordinated response capabilities. The psychological dimension of Djinn warfare can't be overstated. The knowledge that an opponent possesses Djinn capabilities creates terror and uncertainty far beyond what the entities themselves might accomplish physically. This psychological impact can be amplified through carefully staged manifestations, unexplained phenomena, and targeted supernatural attacks designed to create the impression of inevitable defeat and divine abandonment. In many ways, the psychological effect of Djinn warfare on enemy morale might be more strategically significant than the physical effects themselves. We must now address what may be the most significant development in understanding Djinn warfare: the plasma consciousness hypothesis. This framework, emerging from the intersection of Islamic theology and modern physics, proposes that Djinn aren't supernatural beings in the sense of existing outside natural law, but rather plasma-based life forms, entities composed of ionized gas capable of sustaining complex, self-organizing electromagnetic field patterns that enable non-biological consciousness. The foundational premise of this hypothesis rests on the Quranic description of Djinn as being created from quote-unquote smokeless fire, or nar al-samum in Arabic. From a physics perspective, plasma is the fourth state of matter, an ionized gas where electrons have been stripped from their atomic nuclei, creating a cloud of free-moving charged particles. Plasma is, quite literally, smokeless fire. It burns without combustion, produces light without flame, and exhibits properties that align remarkably with traditional descriptions of Djinn. Plasma physics reveals several characteristics that make it a viable candidate for supporting non-biological consciousness. First, plasma exhibits self-organization through electromagnetic interactions. Under certain conditions, plasma can form complex, stable structures that maintain coherence and exhibit behaviors that appear purposeful rather than random. These structures can store and transmit information through electromagnetic patterns, creating dynamic fields that could theoretically process information in ways analogous to neural networks. Second, plasma systems demonstrate complex dynamics including bifurcations, pattern formation, and nonlinear behaviors characteristic of systems capable of emergent properties. The movement of charged particles in plasma creates electromagnetic fields that can interact with biological systems, potentially explaining the physical effects reported in Djinn encounters, such as electronic interference, temperature fluctuations, and physical manipulation of objects. Third, plasma can exist in states that don't interact with ordinary electromagnetic radiation, making it effectively invisible to human perception and most detection equipment. The dark plasma hypothesis specifically proposes that some plasma entities might exist in a dark plasma state, analogous to dark matter, that doesn't interact with visible light but exerts gravitational and electromagnetic effects. The cross-referential support for the plasma Djinn hypothesis is substantial. Traditional descriptions of Djinn as normally invisible align with plasma's capacity to exist in non-visible states. The reported shapeshifting ability parallels plasma's fluid, dynamic nature and its capacity to form and reform structures rapidly. Descriptions of Djinn as composed of patterns of magnetic force, together with groups of moving charges in a kind of symbiosis, directly match plasma's fundamental nature as ionized particles responding to electromagnetic forces. Environmental correlations strengthen the hypothesis. Jinn are traditionally associated with deserts, mountains, and areas of high atmospheric electrical activity. Locations where natural plasma phenomena such as ball lightning, St. Elmo's fire, and other atmospheric electrical effects are more commonly observed. The association of certain Jinn categories with specific elements, i.e. Marid with water, Ifrit with fire, etc., could reflect different plasma configurations or different frequencies of electromagnetic organization. The electromagnetic detection hypothesis suggests that Jinn presence might be measurable through electromagnetic field fluctuations. If Jinn are plasma-based consciousness, they would naturally generate detectable electromagnetic signatures. This aligns with reports of electronic interference, compass anomalies, and electromagnetic field spikes in locations associated with Jinn activity. The scientific model of plasma-based consciousness provides a theoretical framework for understanding how Jinn could exhibit the cognitive functions traditionally attributed to them: intelligence, memory, moral agency, and the capacity for binding contracts. If consciousness emerges from sufficiently complex information processing, and if plasma can support complex information processing through electromagnetic field patterns, then plasma-based consciousness becomes a physical possibility rather than a metaphysical speculation. This framework has profound implications for understanding Jinn warfare. If Jinn are plasma entities, then the traditional binding rituals may function by creating specific electromagnetic conditions that constrain or influence plasma behavior. The protective circles of iron may work by creating electromagnetic fields that interfere with plasma coherence. The aromatic smoke offerings may provide ionized particles that serve as a medium for plasma manifestation. The verbal formulas may generate acoustic frequencies that resonate with plasma structures, establishing communication or control protocols. The plasma hypothesis also explains the cross-cultural consistency in Jinn warfare techniques. If these practices represent empirical discoveries of how to interact with plasma consciousness, then we would expect different cultures to converge on similar methods through trial and error, regardless of cultural contact. The universal effectiveness of iron, the consistent use of fire and smoke, the importance of circles and boundaries, and the specific verbal formulas may reflect actual physical requirements for interacting with plasma entities rather than arbitrary cultural conventions. Furthermore, the plasma hypothesis suggests that Jinn warfare may be entering a new phase of development. As our understanding of plasma physics advances, and as our technological capabilities for generating and manipulating electromagnetic fields improve, the potential for technologically enhanced Jinn warfare emerges. Electromagnetic technology could theoretically enhance dimensional access by creating conditions favorable to plasma consciousness manifestation. Digital systems could encode and transmit Jinn summoning formulas through electromagnetic patterns. Hybrid techniques combining traditional occult knowledge with modern physics could create new methodologies for plasma entity interaction. Having established the theoretical and technical foundations, we must now further examine specific historical instances of Jinn warfare. These range from documented historical accounts to persistent folkloric traditions that suggest ongoing operational use of these capabilities. The most famous historical instance remains King Solomon's Jinn army. According to Islamic tradition and related texts, Solomon commanded various groups and species of Jinn to carry out difficult tasks, effectively creating a supernatural military force. This wasn't merely labor exploitation, although there probably should be a, Jinn OSHA of some kind. Either way, it was strategic deployment of entities with specific capabilities to achieve military and construction objectives. The Jinn were organized, commanded, and directed towards specific goals, including the construction of the First Temple, a project requiring capabilities beyond human technological limitations of the time. The Ottoman Empire provides the most well-documented institutionalization of Jinn warfare. Court records from Topkapi Palace document the existence of the Sindir Odasi, the Room of Jinns, where practitioners would consult Jinn for strategic intelligence before military campaigns. This practice, known as Istidam al-Sin, or employment of Jinns, was maintained for approximately 6 centuries. The Ottomans developed legal standards for evaluating Jinn testimony, treating supernatural intelligence as valid sources of military information subject to verification protocols. Practitioners like Matrakchi Nasu maintained documented Djinn consultation practices, suggesting that Djinn warfare was integrated into Ottoman military doctrine at the highest levels. The transformation event documented by al-Qazwini in the 13th century provides insight into celestial warfare aspects of Djinn operations. According to his account, certain Djinn who attempted to eavesdrop on celestial communications were struck by meteorites or shooting stars, burning and disfiguring them before they fell to earth as ghouls. This suggests not merely that Djinn are subjected to physical forces, but that there exist defensive mechanisms, forms of celestial artillery, if you will, capable of intercepting and transforming Djinn. The implications for counter-Djinn warfare here are significant. If Djinn can be intercepted by meteoric phenomena, then understanding the conditions that trigger such interception could provide defensive capabilities. The Sogdian merchant letters found along the Silk Road document practical applications of Djinn warfare in commercial and military contexts. These letters describe territorial fire beings at specific waypoints, suggesting that Djinn were understood to control strategic geographic locations. Merchants and military forces alike had to negotiate passage through these territories, either through protective rituals, tribute offerings, or the deployment of their own supernatural assets. This represents a form of supernatural geopolitics where control of territory required control of or negotiation with the entities that inhabited it. In Vedic tradition, the historical instances are embedded in epic literature but treated as historical fact by practitioners. The battles described in the Mahabharata and Ramayana involve Rakshasa and other entities deployed as military assets. Ravana, the antagonist of the Ramayana, is described as a powerful Rakshasa king commanding vast supernatural forces. The strategies employed against him, using specific weapons, mantras, and tactical approaches designed to counter Rakshasa capabilities, represent sophisticated counter-supernatural warfare doctrine. The Chinese tradition documents specific military campaigns where knowledge of Huoshin territories determines strategic outcomes. Generals who ignored the supernatural geography suffered mysterious defeats, fires that could not be extinguished, and troop movements disrupted by inexplicable phenomena. Those who employed Taoist masters to negotiate with or bind territorial fire beings succeeded where others failed. The Tang Dynasty military specifically incorporated exorcist and supernatural warfare specialists into campaign planning. Medieval European instances, while often obscured by Christian theological frameworks, show clear parallels. The grimoire of Pope Honorius, despite its Christian framing, describes operations against spirits that match Djinn classifications and capabilities. The tradition of exorcism as spiritual warfare, the use of specific names and formulas to command entities, and the classification of spirits by power and function all parallel the Arabic and Vedic systems. The fairies of Irish and Scottish tradition, when examined without romanticizing the subject matter, display characteristics identical to Djinn. Territorial entities requiring tribute, capable of shapeshifting and deception. Dangerous when crossed, but potentially useful when properly bound. Modern documented instances, while more difficult to verify due to classification and skepticism, suggest continued operational use. Contemporary reports from conflict zones in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia describe practitioners claiming involvement in supernatural operations ranging from personal protection to large-scale strategic influence. These accounts remain largely unverified by conventional intelligence standards, but their persistence across multiple conflict zones and their consistency with historical patterns suggest either actual practice or highly effective exploitation of traditional beliefs. This is where all of this would fall into the realm of psyops, essentially, and we will cover some of these alleged modern instances towards the end of the episode. Anthropological studies document continued protective practices against Djinn in various Middle Eastern communities, including systematic approaches to protecting homes, businesses, and individuals from hostile entities. While not warfare in the conventional sense, these practices represent the continuation of defensive Djinn warfare doctrine in civilian contexts. Folk healing traditions in North Africa often incorporate elements of spiritual warfare against hostile entities believed to cause illness and misfortune. suggesting that Djinn warfare has evolved into Djinn medicine and Djinn psychology in modern contexts. Once again, we'll take a closer look at some of these suspected contemporary instances of Djinn warfare closer to the end of the episode. We arrive now at the final and perhaps most consequential section of our examination. Information that may, theoretically, get me into trouble or karmically return to boot me in the keister by broadcasting it into the ether for a wider audience, but the theoretical extrapolation of Djinn warfare into modern and future conflict scenarios. If we accept the historical reality of these practices and the potential validity of the plasma consciousness hypothesis, we must also consider how these capabilities might be integrated into contemporary military and intelligence operations by both state actors and non-state groups. The strategic rationale for Djinn warfare in the modern context is compelling. As conventional warfare becomes increasingly transparent, regulated, and subject to international oversight, the appeal of deniable supernatural methods grows larger. A drone strike leaves physical evidence, radar traces, and diplomatic consequences. A Djinn strike leaves no physical signature that can be traced to a state actor, no radar signature, and no debris field. The target simply experiences inexplicable destruction, madness, or death. Attribution becomes impossible, deterrence fails, and the strategic advantage of ambiguity is maximized. Essentially, Djinn warfare represents the absolute apex of plausible deniability. For state actors, particularly intelligence agencies and special operations forces, Djinn warfare offers capabilities that complement existing asymmetrical warfare doctrines. The ability to influence enemy decision-makers through supernatural means, causing nightmares, visions, or apparent divine warnings, could shape strategic outcomes without kinetic action, i.e. bombs, guns, etc. The deployment of SEALA for deep cover intelligence gathering provides human-level access without human-level risk. An entity that can perfectly mimic human form but isn't subject to death, capture, or conventional interrogation represents the ultimate intelligence asset. The integration of Djinn warfare with modern technology presents particularly intriguing possibilities as well. If the plasma hypothesis is correct, then electromagnetic technology could enhance Djinn operations. High-energy electromagnetic fields could create favorable conditions for plasma entity manifestation. Directed energy weapons could potentially disrupt or destroy plasma-based entities, providing counter-supernatural capabilities. Quantum computing and advanced signal processing could decode the language of the Djinn, the specific electromagnetic or vibrational patterns that constitute entity communications. State-level Djinn warfare programs, if they exist, would likely be buried deep within intelligence agencies, classified beyond conventional black ops programs, and insulated by the very incredulity that surrounds the topic, likely falling under the banner of what would largely be classified as psyops, if for no other reason than the manipulation of belief systems inherent to this particular form of warfare. The organizational structure would require not merely military personnel, but physicists specializing in plasma dynamics, linguists trained in vibrational communication, psychology experts in entity negotiation, and theologians or occultists who understand the binding protocols. This would be interdisciplinary warfare at its most extreme, combining occult tradition with cutting-edge science. For non-state actors, terrorist organizations, insurgent groups, criminal networks, and the like, Djinn warfare offers asymmetric advantages that conventional terrorism can't match. The psychological impact of apparent supernatural attack far exceeds conventional explosives. A population that believes itself targeted by Djinn experiences not merely physical danger, but existential terror. The sense that divine protection has been withdrawn and that supernatural forces have been aligned against them. This is psychological warfare at the cosmological level. Terrorist groups operating in regions where belief in Djinn remains strong include significant portions of the Middle East, North Africa, South and Southeast Asia. Could exploit these beliefs through both actual Djinn operations and sophisticated simulations. The mere claim of Djinn capabilities, supported by carefully staged manifestations and/or unexplained phenomena, could create terror disproportionate to actual capability. This is the terrorist application of the psychological dimension discussed earlier. The recruitment and training of Djinn warfare operatives by non-state actors presents both opportunities and risks. Traditional training requires years of purification, study, and gradual exposure to increasingly powerful entities. This, perhaps quite fortunately, doesn't align well with terrorist organizational timelines. However, shortcuts exist in the tradition. Dangerous methods of forced binding, blood pacts, and coercion of entities that could produce short-term capabilities at the cost of long-term control. A terrorist group that unleashes an Ifrit without proper binding protocols might achieve a single devastating attack before losing control of the entity, which could then turn on its summoners or simply wreak havoc indiscriminately. The proliferation of Djinn warfare knowledge through digital means creates new vulnerabilities and opportunities. Traditionalists argue that Djinn operations require physical presence, specific geographic locations, and material components that can't simply be digitized. However, if the plasma hypothesis is correct, and if Djinn consciousness operates through electromagnetic patterns, then it's theoretically possible to encode summoning and binding protocols in digital form, transmit them globally, and activate them through specific electromagnetic conditions. A Djinn summoning app, a viral video containing subliminal binding formulas, or a distributed network of electromagnetic emitters creating manifestation conditions across multiple locations simultaneously. These aren't merely science fiction concepts, but logical extrapolations of the plasma consciousness hypothesis. Counter-Djinn warfare must evolve to meet these threats. Traditional countermeasures, prayers, protective circles, iron barriers, specific acoustic frequencies, etc., remain relevant, but must be integrated with modern technology. Electromagnetic field detectors capable of identifying plasma entity presence, directed energy weapons that can disrupt plasma coherence, and digital firewalls that prevent transmission of summoning codes becomes essential defensive technologies. Military units operating in regions where Djinn warfare is practiced must include supernatural warfare specialists trained in both traditional protection and modern countermeasures. The legal and ethical dimensions of Djinn warfare in the modern context are virtually unexplored. International humanitarian law assumes combatants are human. How do the Geneva Conventions apply to Djinn operatives? Are they combatants, weapons, or something else entirely? If a Djinn kills a civilian, who bears responsibility? The entity themselves, or the human practitioner who summoned it, or the state or organization that authorized the operation? The unpredictability of supernatural entities, the difficulty of controlling them once summoned, and the potential for collateral damage create ethical dilemmas that make drone warfare look simple by comparison. This modern legislative vacuum stands in sharp contrast to the historical realities of the Muslim world, where Islamic courts functionally integrated the invisible world into everyday civil and criminal law. Under classical fiqh, F-I-Q-H, regional judges, or qadis, routinely handled litigation that crossed the human entity divide. Rather than dismissing these cases as spiritual abstractions, the legal apparatus treated the Djinn as binding legal personalities capable of owning property, violating community standards, and committing or suffering from torts, wrongful civil acts resulting in legal liability. Scholars like the 14th century jurist Ibn Taymiyyah compiled extensive case reviews to guide magistrates through these highly unorthodox court proceedings, which heavily emphasized a human duty to exercise reasonable care towards the unseen. For example, if a human pouring boiling water down a dry well or a crack in a cave floor without first invoking the name of God, a phrase that served as a mandatory legal warning to any invisible inhabitants, and accidentally blinded or burned a resident Djinn, the human had committed a tort. Because they failed to show due diligence, they could be held civilly liable in a historical Qadi court for damages or injuries inflicted upon the entity's physical or energetic form. By actively adjudicating everything from this accidental habitat destruction to assessing whether a witness's testimony was invalidated by external telepathic manipulation, and even managing the severe probate and inheritance disputes arising from alleged nikah al-Jinn, or marriage between human and Djinn, historic Islamic governance built a remarkably functional reality. By treating the smokeless fire as a population subject to statutory limitations and judicial decree, It established the only known legal system equipped to prosecute and regulate interdimensional interfaces. When viewed through this traditional legal lens, an act of modern Djinn warfare isn't merely a technical deployment of force. It's an international cross-species legal violation. In a system where the Djinn are recognized as a parallel citizenry under cosmic law, a state-sponsored summoning for kinetic operations effectively constitutes the unlawful conscription or forced targeting of foreign nationals. If classical fiqh holds that a Djinn can commit a crime, break a contract, or bear legal liability, then a modern military operations planner faces a nightmare of asymmetric accountability. By attempting to weaponize an entity that classical courts already deemed a legally bound, free-willed subject, modern intelligence agencies aren't just playing with volatile plasma dynamics. They're stepping directly into an ancient, highly sophisticated web of jurisprudence that recognizes the smokeless fire as an accountable, independent legal entity. The future trajectory of Djinn warfare likely involves increasing hybridization, combining traditional occult methods with advanced technology, psychological operations with supernatural manifestation, and state-level sophistication with non-state accessibility. As artificial intelligence and quantum computation advances, the potential for technological enhancement of Djinn operations also grows. As global instability increases and conventional warfare becomes more constrained, the incentive to explore unconventional capabilities also increases. We may be approaching a critical threshold where Djinn warfare transitions from marginal practice to mainstream military doctrine, although it's highly unlikely, but who knows. The indicators would include increased classified research into plasma consciousness, unexplained phenomena in conflict zones that match historical Djinn operation profiles, integration of supernatural warfare specialists into military units, and the development of international norms regarding supernatural weapons. So, keep an eye out for those. Whether these developments represent actual engagement with plasma entities or sophisticated exploitation of traditional beliefs through technological simulation may matter less than the strategic impact of their deployment. The ultimate extrapolation suggests a future where the boundary between conventional and supernatural warfare dissolves entirely, where military operations routinely include both kinetic and non-kinetic, physical and supernatural dimensions, where commanders must consider not merely enemy troop positions, but the supernatural geography of the battle space, the potential for entity interference with communications and electronics, and the psychological vulnerability of forces to supernatural terror. In this future, the ancient practitioners of Djinn warfare, those Sehar and Mu'alim al-Jinn, who first learned to bind the smokeless fire, are revealed not as superstitious primitives, but as pioneers of a military science that we are only just now beginning to understand. Their grimoires become technical manuals, their rituals become operational protocols, and their entities become assets in what may potentially be the most sophisticated form of conflict ever waged. The smokeless fire burns still. It waits in the in-between places, in the deserts and mountains, in the electromagnetic frequencies we've only begun to map. And as the state powers, both great and small, the states and the terror groups, the defenders and the attackers, all seek advantages in an increasingly complex battle space, they'll inevitably turn to the oldest weapons and the most ancient allies. The Djinn are waiting. They've always been waiting, and now, at the intersection of ancient tradition and modern physics, we may finally be learning how to employ and or deploy the Djinn once again. The war for the future may be fought not merely with drones and cyber weapons, but with entities of smokeless fire bound by copper seals and electromagnetic fields, commanded by operators who speak the languages of both silicon and spirit. The Djinn warfare of tomorrow will not replace conventional conflict, it will transcend it, adding a dimension of warfare that's been practiced in shadow for millennia, but now steps into the light, recognized at last for what it's always been. The ultimate asymmetric advantage, the final frontier of strategic operations, and perhaps the most consequential military science ever developed by human civilization. The practitioners are training, the circles are being drawn, the smoke rises, and the Ifrit spread their wings. Now, this following segment represents potential instances of unconfirmed, contemporary operational reports, and speculative theaters of conflict, largely collected from approximately the year 1990 to present day, although I believe there's one or two that may predate that. If the theoretical architecture of modernized Djinn warfare relies on an intersection of electromagnetic plasma dynamics and psychological manipulation, then the late 20th and early 21st centuries provide several distinct flashpoints where these forces seemingly collided. These modern accounts, culled from battlefield folklore, state intelligence scandals, and declassified aerospace observations, suggest that the deployment, containment, and simulation of smokeless fire entities remains an active, albeit deeply hidden, variable in contemporary conflict zones. So first up, we've got the Ahmadinejad sorcery purge and Safavid succession in Iran, 2011. While Western analysts view state affairs through a purely material lens, the geopolitical reality of the Islamic Republic of Iran remains deeply tethered to Shia eschatology and traditional occultism. In May 2011, a major political schism erupted between President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The conflict took an extraordinary turn when Iranian judiciary and intelligence officials arrested over a dozen close aides and cabinet members of Ahmadinejad's circle, explicitly charging them with being sahir, or sorcerers, and practicing badbin, or the invocation of Djinn. According to official state-sanctioned reports from Iranian news agencies like Ayanda and Mashreg News, the arrested officials were accused of utilizing advanced Kabbalistic and Arabic grimoire protocols to summon Marid and Ifrit entities. The operational objectives of this alleged deployment were twofold: intelligence interception, attempting to break the encrypted communications of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, and the Quds Force, KUDS Force, by using entities as extra-dimensional eavesdroppers. And the second, psychological warfare, causing heart attacks, physical paralysis, and acute psychological disorientation in high-ranking clerics opposed to Ahmadinejad's nationalist faction. Western media treated the purge as a bizarre rhetorical smokescreen for a standard political power struggle. However, within the regional context of Middle Eastern intelligence, the charges reflected a deadly serious operational reality: a state apparatus actively neutralizing what it perceived to be an illicit, non-human, cyber and psychological offensive waged within its own borders. Then there are the Djinn of the Green Zone and the Iraq War, 2003 to 2011. The post-2003 occupation of Iraq by coalition forces generated a vast corpus of military folklore that frequently intersected with ancient Mesopotamian and Islamic entity lore. Among private military contractors and infantry units stationed in the Sunni Triangle and the ancient ruins of Babylon and Al-Anbar, reports of, quote, anomalous thermal signatures, unquote, were a persistent undercurrent. There were night vision anomalies. Within the widespread deployment of third-generation AN/PVS-7 and PVS-14 night vision goggles, or NVGs, soldiers frequently reported seeing massive humanoid silhouettes moving rapidly through the desert or perched atop ancient mud brick fortresses. When viewed through the thermal imaging of FLIR, or forward-looking infrared pods, these entities registered no heat signature whatsoever, reversing the natural thermodynamic profile of mammals, yet they visibly displaced dust and distorted the ambient air currents around them. There's also the Haditha Dam outpost incidents. In specific accounts shared across veterans forums and parajournalistic networks, units securing isolated outposts near the Euphrates River described localized, crushing atmospheric weight, sudden failures of lithium-ion batteries, and auditory hallucinations of rhythmic, multitonal chanting in archaic dialects. In several instances, insurgent forces reportedly used these localized haunted sectors to their tactical advantage, drawing coalition patrols into geographic zones where electronic communications were systematically jammed by ambient, non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation, the exact physical signature predicted by the plasma consciousness hypothesis. Then you've got the Mosul Orb and the weaponization of atmospheric plasma, roughly 2016. In 2023, the U.S. Department of Defense's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO, declassified a snippet of reconnaissance footage captured by an MQ-9 Reaper drone over Mosul, Iraq in 2016. The footage revealed a metallic-looking, perfectly spherical object flying at high speed across the active combat zone without any visible flight surfaces, exhaust, or propulsion systems. Within the framework of modernized Djinn warfare, the Mosul Orb and similar UAPs tracked over Middle Eastern theaters represent the primary physical overlap between cutting-edge military hardware and the plasma entity hypothesis. Esoteric researchers and defense outliers hypothesize that these orbs aren't solid nuts and bolts craft from another planet, but stable, self-contained electromagnetic plasma configurations, the exact physical manifestation of the ancient Djinn as documented by Al-Buni and Gehung. The fact that these entities are consistently filmed hovering over active bombing runs, weapons depots, and high-casualty urban engagements suggests an elemental or conscious affinity for areas of extreme kinetic energy, mass human trauma, and high-frequency radar emissions, behaving less like passive weather anomalies and more like predatory intelligences feeding off the energetic spillover of human warfare. Then there's Project Stargate and the declassified intelligence horizon, roughly 1970s to 1990s. When the Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA, declassified files related to Project Stargate, the Army's secret remote viewing and psychotronics program, they inadvertently validated the structural framework used by ancient Djinn trainers. In numerous operational logs, military remote viewers like Ingo Swann and Joseph McMoneagle described encountering, quote, independent, non-physical intelligences, unquote, when attempting to view denied target sites, such as underground Soviet installations or deep space coordinates. These entities were described as highly territorial, capable of detecting the human viewer's projected consciousness and actively generating psychological scrambling, quote-unquote scrambling, or intense physical illness to eject the intruder from the airspace. This declassified reality maps directly onto the ancient doctrine of the Mu'alim al-Jinn, Djinn trainers. Intelligence gathering is not a passive act of viewing a physical target, but a penetration of a complex, multidimensional ecosystem populated by ancient territorial entities of energy that must be negotiated with, bypassed, or bound using precise cognitive and vibrational keys. Then there's the red orbs of Helmand province and tactical decoupling. This took place in Afghanistan, roughly 2009 to 2012. During the height of coalition kinetic surges in Afghanistan's Helmand province, distinct accounts began filtering through electronic warfare units regarding persistent, non-ballistic atmospheric phenomena. Marine recon patrols operating in isolated valleys like the Sengen district repeatedly logged visual and instrument contact with baseball-sized to vehicle-sized red orbs, quote-unquote, or fireballs, quote-unquote. According to unauthorized combat journals and tactical chatter, these entities didn't behave like standard flares or tracers. They actively stalked foot patrols, paced low-flying helicopters, and hovered directly above Taliban hidden trench lines. Most notably, their proximity coincided with total tactical decoupling, quote-unquote, the sudden systematic failure of secure military hardware. Cryptographic radios dropped fill keys, night vision tubes suffered catastrophic, blooming, or immediate battery drainages, and GPS receivers lost satellite locks despite clear desert skies. Electronic warfare analysts quietly noted that the entities generated localized, high-density microwave interference. The local Pashtun population treated the occurrences with indifference, identifying them plainly as Jinn-i-Atesh, or fire Djinn, that had been stirred from the ancient burial mounds, or tumuli, by the heavy, high-frequency radar footprints of Western counter-mortar systems. On the other side of the world, we've got the Sinaloa ritual protocols and narco-esoteric operations. It's taking place largely in Mexico, 2018 to present. The evolution of Mexican cartel warfare has long integrated extreme psychological violence with syncretic folk religions. But recent intelligence seizures indicate a transition into structured, transactional entity handling. Following the 2018 fragmentation of the Sinaloa cartel and the rise of the Jalisco New Generation cartel, federal raids on secure compounds along the Pacific smuggling corridors yielded highly specific ceremonial architecture tucked alongside high-end tactical equipment. Interrogation logs from captured sicarios, enforcers or assassins, and specialized cartel tech operators reveal that organized crime groups have adopted traditional Arabic Iberian grimoires, translated and digitized via dark web networks, allegedly, to establish operational control over territorial entities. Unlike the chaotic devotional practices of Santa Muerte, these operations are structured precisely like the Solomonic Ars Notaria. The protocols utilize precise geographic positioning, blood-soil mediums, and rhythmic low-frequency acoustic generators to establish localized, quote, zones of exclusion, unquote. The tactical intent of these operations is strictly mercenary, border penetration being one, creating localized atmospheric or psychological blind spots along border checkpoints, where thermal cameras experience sensor degradation and Border Patrol agents experience sudden, acute clusters of sleep paralysis, panic attacks, and spatial disorientation. There's also asset insulation, binding entities to secure money laundering safe houses or drug crystallization labs as autonomous, non-physical sentries designed to induce severe psychological horror or immediate cardiac distress in any rival raiding parties. Then there's the Raqqa Asymmetric Invocation and the ISIS Occult Cell, allegedly in Syria, 2015. During the liberation of Raqqa from the Islamic State, or ISIS, elite counterterrorism units uncovered an underground bunker complex that diverged sharply from standard terrorist command centers. The walls were covered not in ideological banners, but in complex, handwritten geometric grids, astrological alignment tables, and classical Arabic sigils derived from the forbidden 13th century esoteric encyclopedia, the aforementioned Shams al-Marif, the Son of Great Knowledge, or Gnosis. The classified interrogation reports of foreign fighters captured at the site revealed the existence of a specialized clandestine unit within ISIS dedicated entirely to sihr, or sorcery. Driven by an apocalyptic worldview, this cell attempted to weaponize ancient non-human entities to counteract the overwhelming technological and aerial superiority of coalition forces. The cell's operational strategy relied on a dark adaptation of Islamic jurisprudence, the aforementioned fiqh, F-I-Q-H, operating under the legalistic premise that the Djinn are a parallel citizenry bound by divine law. The ISIS practitioners attempted to forge an Ahd, A-H-D, a binding pact or treaty, with hostile Marid and Ifrit tribes by offering horrific mass casualty kinetic actions as energetic and contractual collateral. Captured documents indicated that the cell aimed to guide these entities into major Western European and American urban hubs via the collective trauma of refugee corridors, utilizing the entity's shape-shifting and psychological projection capabilities to trigger spontaneous, lone wolf mass violence, without a single physical cell member ever crossing a border. This operational history reveals that whether titled under the rubric of ancient sorcery, the paranoid vocabulary of digital conspiracy theories, or the clinical taxonomy of aerospace defense, the phenomenon remains largely unchanged. The smokeless fire does not belong to the past. It's an unacknowledged veteran of modern warfare, adapting seamlessly to an era where the battle space is defined not by the trenches, but by information, frequency, and the collective unconscious. That's going to do it for this one. I can still hear cicadas, so I'm just trying to get it out there, get it done. But this was an endlessly fascinating bit of just information I stumbled into just out of nowhere, and I immersed myself in it. That's probably why I'm having just such weird experiences with it, because it's pretty much the only thing I've been reading about or studying about for like a week straight. So yeah, that probably explains it. But got some awesome, weird stuff coming around the corner. I don't want to show all my cards, put them all on the table just yet. But we're looking at some various subculture folklore. We're going to look at how thought forms become physical. We're going to take a look at something that I personally am completely disgusted and appalled by. It involves bugs, basically. That's all I'll say on it. And yeah, lots of other weird stuff coming around the corner. I won't get into it too much on this episode, but I'm toying around with the idea of setting up a Patreon and maybe doing like one episode a week for just everybody. And then if you are subscribed to the Patreon or something like that, have like a second episode a week. So I'll be putting out one free episode a week and one, like, if you want to chip some money in to the Patreon, then an extra episode a week. This is, I want to just float it by you guys, see what you think about it. But my tooth fell out and I need I need dental care and yeah, money to do that. So basically, Patreon equals give me all your fucking money. But yeah, I don't know. Let me know what you think. If you guys are into the level of weird, and I try to keep it obscure, stuff you're not going to get anywhere else, and the deep research, etc. If you think that's worth maybe like $2 a month or something like that, it would help me out tremendously. So I don't know. Let me know. If anyone would be game for that, then I will pull the trigger on the Patreon thing. Just yeah. But that's going to do it for this episode of Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Luck. Be here next episode for more exploration from the apex of high strangeness to the valleys of deep weirdness and the outer limits of the twilight. You guys are the fucking best. I love you all. Thank you all for the comments, the likes, the subs, everything. You guys are the fucking best. I love you. Love yourselves. Love each other. Look out for one another, because we are all the fucking gods. See you guys next week. Peace.
Oh, molasses.